What comes to your mind when you hear Confucianism or Confucius? Anyone? It's all muted now.
China?
China, philosophy, all right. What else? One more, maybe?
Ethical teachings.
Ethical teachings, yeah. So they are correct.
Hierarchy?
Hierarchy, yep. Hierarchy. We'll talk about it a little bit later. Yep, so China, philosophy, ethical teachings, hierarchy. All right, good to start. All right, let's talk about that. First, we talk about a little bit geography and history and some of the scriptures and philosophy. Then we move on to Confucianism in Southeast Asia. So you have Confucius, right? It's it's a spiritual figure, a teacher, a master that many people in China would consider, the founder of the letter called Confucian tradition. Although he himself never saw, himself as the founder of a religion. He was the transmitter of the ancient tradition. He transmitted the teachings and the ritual, the tradition that had been around for many time, many centuries before his time. So it's basically how to preserve many aspects of these philosophical teachings and ritual, so that people after him would still, follow the ancient way. So to give you a sense of, the breadth and the size of what we call as Chinese religion or philosophies, it is very difficult to count the membership because it's not about membership. And if you ask people about whether or not they are Confucians, it's very rare that you will find that they would respond that they are Confucian, because Confucianism is not like a membership, like when you say, I'm a Christian or I'm a Muslim, or even in other cases I'm a Hindu and so on and so forth. So it's not like identity that matters here. It's more about cultural, philosophical, ethical attachment. That they have somehow attachment to the ancient way of Confucius in the classics, in the tradition. So only if you have the number, only 6 million Confucian, which is very small compared to Chinese peoples around the world, number one in the world. So Tao is in other, even Taoism, one of the other ethical teaching and philosophies, or some also say religions, 20 to 400 millions people might consider themselves Taoists. But again, the number is very tricky here, right? So it is not about identity. Buddhism is almost the same, case, 100 million, but you will find more than just 100 millions. And you know that many people, they follow some aspects of Buddhist meditation and philosophies without necessarily being a Buddhist or without converting to Buddhism as a religious practice. Right? So when we talk about Chinese religion or Chinese religious traditions, you will, you will talk between 200 and 400, even more million people, but I would say more than just this number. And then when we call Chinese religion, we might include Confucian, Taoist, Buddhist tradition, and in fact, you have, Chinese Christians, Muslim, Chinese Muslims, and others as well, right? So, but the mainstream perspective of Chinese religion would include Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. And that's why it is sometimes called syncretic, tradition. But again, when we use the term syncretism, it is a problematic term. It's just to refer to things that are different, in terms of the sources, but in terms of the practice, you don't really have separation. The people don't necessarily say, well, this is a Buddhist practice, this is a Taoist practice, this is a Confucian practice that I do. So they don't necessarily distinguish one from the other practice that they do. So syncretism is from the outside perspective, right? When we, as a scholars or observers or students, see, oh, that one is, a Buddhist dimension or Buddhist aspect of it. That one, the other one is a Confucian aspect of it, or the other one is a Taoist aspect of it. Really depending on how we see and define these different religious traditions and philosophies. So, in other words, you don't really have separation or clear boundaries, yeah, especially among the people themselves. And another characteristic of what we call Chinese religion is a commitment to right action more than right belief. In other words, it's about way of life, how to act in this life, more than what you believe, as for example, the origin of the universe, or the life after death, and or like a statement of belief, right? Believe in one God, so you don't really have that kind of uh, you know proclamation of faith, yeah, among them, most of them. So this is why it is quite very complex, and this is why it's very interesting and very important to study. So as I already mentioned before, like reconciliation of differences between belief system, meaning between philosophies and ethical teachings and rituals, without necessarily contradiction in the perspectives. Some aspects of what we call, this is again what we call Chinese religions, are this: deities. So deities, gods, most, they would say they are supernatural beings or powers, sometimes said as heaven or Tian or heaven. So heaven is, like the way of heaven, as the mandate of heaven, for example, comes among the emperors, among the kings, and also the rulers. But not only in the notion of heaven, especially among Taoists, you would find more like the way of earth, and even the way of human. How to be human, how to be earthly, how to be natural. Among philosophical Taoists, they would have this understanding of the way of the natural way. Among religious Taoists who focus on religious worship and veneration of spirits, you would find deities, local deities that they venerate and worship. Then you have, Buddhists also, who have their own deities associated with different powers in the play, either especially among Mahayana Buddhists or Chinese Mahayana Buddhists. So deities are there, but you have a lot, yeah, you have a lot, and then you have also some notion of a universal power, sometimes called heaven, as this supernatural power. And then we will talk a little bit more later again. Authoritative texts. There are a lot of texts associated with Confucianism and Taoism and Buddhism, as we already discussed earlier, but the popular religion, the popular Chinese peoples would not necessarily refer to the text. Again, this is ancient way of doing things, like hierarchy, like filial piety, for example, like veneration of the ancestors, right? They don't necessarily have to go back to the scripture, to the classic, in order to say that this is our Chinese way or our way. But even though they are non-textual, you do have many Confucian or Chinese peoples and individuals considering the classics as the authoritative text. Then you have among Taoists who have also Tao De Jing, for example, considered as authoritative. So you do have a different authoritative text. That's the point about a Chinese religious text. Teachings and practices. Again, I use the term here syncretism. In not that we have to accept it, without qualification, because basically, just to suggest there are different elements that are harmonious and not necessarily contradictory. You also have the notion of self-cultivation and discipline. Yeah, teaching yourself and disciplining yourself so that you can teach other people. So basically, in order to be good in society, you have to be good at yourself. That's the main ethical teaching, we can say. Human kindness, the focus on being human and humankind, it's also very important. And natural way, especially among the Taoists, to live naturally, to go with the flow, for example, among the Taoists who believe, it's not about being extreme, it's not about being purposeful in your action. In fact, you don't have to have an intention, like aggressive intention or explicit motivation when you do things. You do things, you do good things just because it is good, and just do it naturally, even without being attached to some kind of power beyond this natural world. All religions teach people to be good. So there's a Chinese saying to suggest that. So in other words, there is a dimension of avoiding conflicts and chaos in society. You might wonder why this emphasis on avoiding conflict. In other words, harmony, right? The very important value of harmony. One way of describing or explaining this is that you had a Chinese civilization, Chinese peoples, fighting against each other. It's about power, about economic resources, about, there's so many things. That's why you have dynasties, different dynasties throughout histories. And, you have a social chaos. That's why, harmony was the value that they emphasize. And that's why harmony is one of the key characteristics of Chinese religion, because of the context of conflicts. Here you have the map, the very brief map and small, and broad map of the dynasties, of the Shang dynasty, Zhao dynasty. So you have BCE, we are talking about BCE, before Common Era, and Zhao dynasty and Qin dynasty and Han dynasty, all the way to the a Common Era. So you have India and you have China here. And that's why China and India are neighbors. And then that's why they have connection and Silk Road. Yes, Silk Road. all the way to India and China, India, and then Southeast, and part of, then you will find the trade route, Silk Route, trade route. That's how different religious traditions were transmitted. So the Great Wall of China, this is just to remind us about the importance of power, and to protect your country, your civilization, basically, as they understood it, uh, from any external attacks, or danger. And it's just one examples how boundaries were made, and this is a response to all these kind of conflicts, wars between emperors. Let's move to key figures in Confucian tradition. Confucius, Mencius, and Sun Tzu. Roughly speaking, they live around these times, 500 to 400 BCE, and then 300 to 200 BCE, and Sun Tzu 300 and 200 BCE, right? But their years are sometimes different. Different books talk about different, but they're not really different. For those who need some kind of general idea about where and when they live, you have this years 500 to 400, around that time. So the first one, Confucius, Master Kung, or Kung Zi, he lived in the state of Lu, and then during Zhou dynasty that we mentioned earlier. And one of the main things about him, again, is that he considered himself a transmitter, not a founder, not a maker, not an inventor of a new religion. So he transmitted the ancient way. He didn't find or didn't invent the way, or the ancient way. It's according to Analects, that we will talk about later. One of the passages about Confucius, that when he is reported to have said, at 15, my mind sought learning. At 30, my character was firmly set. At 40, my doubts were at an end. At 50, I knew the will of heaven. At 60, I could hear the truth with equanimity. At 70, I unwillingly desire what was right. Again, according to the Analects. So basically what it suggests is, you have a gradual step to learning and to become more and more, mature morally, from being a learner to become to find what was right. So learning as a process, and then reaching the mastery of the will of heaven, and then you felt that you had some knowledge about the truth. The key ethical teachings that we can get from Confucius are as follows. So gentlemen, this idea of gentleman, it's very interesting, because before, you are noble because you are born to nobility. Is now nobility by morality. Nobility, you are noble because of your moral character, rather than your birth, rather than you are born into certain hierarchy, a social class, and so on and so forth. So this idea of gentleman is one of the key ethical teachings. Morality. Humanness is again about morality, but it is about how to become morally human, or human, and benevolence, and then you have other interpretation like compassion, and so on. The third one is filial piety, which is basically being good to your parents, your ancestors, your relatives. So his xiao is filial piety. So you're pious in terms of your relationship with your family. Li, your propriety, means that you do things according to the ritual, according to the ancient way, correctly. It also involves rites or ritual, but it might also involve, includes the notion of good manners, etiquette. So etiquette, how you behave to your parents, to your ruler, how you behave to your neighbors, your friends, and so on and so forth. But that's one way. But another way is how you also do certain things according to the ritual, according to the ancient way of doing things. So Li is very important here. Then you have virtu, de, which is again morality, but this is to again emphasize the notion of nobility by morality or virtue, ethics rather than by birth. Ethics of reciprocity, it's like when we say silver rule, what you do not wish for yourself, do not do to others. Analects. So what you do not wish for yourself, do not do to others. Yeah, basically, if you don't want to be sick, don't make others also be sick. So do not harm others. Do not harm other people if you don't want to wish harm also for yourself. So that's kind of ethical teachings, and again, this is the key ethical teachings. So we talk about the filiality, ancestor veneration, not to forget the origins, your origins, people's origins, because all things originate from heaven, and humans originate from ancestors. So there is no way to forget them. And then this ancestor would include male and female ancestors. Education is crucial. Yeah, Analects says that at 15, I set my heart mind on learning, as Confucius has said. So it is one aspect of the ethical teachings, education. The question is, what kind of education? That's another question. Generally speaking, education here is education about the classics. Education, you educate yourself and peoples about the ancient way, about ritual, about how to do things correctly. So education here refers to ethical education, or education about the ritual, education about the ancient way of doing things. Another aspect of Confucian ethical teachings is 5 relationship. Well, 5 relationships you don't really have like in the classics or in anything, but this is a summary of relationship that they need to be in harmony with ruler subject. So emperor and minister before have to be mutually harmonious. Then you have father and son, elder, younger brothers, husband, wife, and friends. This is maybe an application of the the reciprocity shu that you will find in the Analects. What you do not wish for yourself, do not do to others. So these kind of relationships are very important. Ruler, subject, father, son, elder, younger brothers, husband, wife, and friends. Right. Those are some of the teachings and characteristics associated with Confucius. Now Mencius. Mencius is the second important figure in Confucian philosophy. One is the idea of yi, rightness, and ren. Again, the idea of morality, humanist, human kindness, and heart mind. This notion of heart mind is very important. Heart mind of compassion, heart mind of shame, meaning you need to observe the rites, the rituals, have minds of respect. So it's a duty to respect, and have minds of right and wrong, meaning you have some kind of wisdom. And one of the key teachings associated with Mencius is this: human nature is essentially good. Among the later Confucian scholars, you had discussion, philosophical debates about the nature of humans or human nature, whether human nature is essentially good, or human nature is essentially bad, or human nature is essentially either good or bad, or both good and bad. There's some discussion about that in the medieval time, and then later on also. Mencius is famous for his, doctrine or teaching that human nature is essentially good. However, even though human nature is essentially good, uh, humans can be divine. Human can make mistakes, can do things that are not according to their nature. So that's why supervision, discipline, and education are important for them. Another thing that we can talk about is chi, or energy, and then we'll talk about virtue, to focus on virtue, again, morality. So the book associated with Mencius, called Book of Mencius, is collection of conversation between Mencius and his disciples, and it's a small book that basically conversation about certain ethical teachings and rules and rulers of the feudal states. Again, feudalism is one of the characteristics of the Chinese at that time. But then you had reform, yeah. So feudalism and reform. So Mencius, Confucius, and then later on Sun Tzu tried to reform feudalism. So feudalism based on birth now had to change to some emphasis on ethics, morality, ritual, and good governance, social harmony, and hierarchy that I also talked about. So you talk about hierarchy before, but hierarchy, social hierarchy, not that they are better than the other, but hierarchy in terms of making sure that everyone is in the same page, in the sense that they have to be dutiful according to their place in society. So if you are a ruler, you have to be, you have to protect the people. If you are the people, you have to also obey the ruler, and so on and so on. So you have a hierarchy in the family, hierarchy in the society, and everyone has to take their own responsibility, have to do their duties according to their place in society. That's why hierarchy and harmony are very much integrated. The next one is Sun Tzu. So before we talk about human nature, or Mencius talk about human nature as essentially good, Sun Tzu says that human nature is essentially bad. So human nature is essentially bad for him. Then it is even more important to do the education and to teach about ritual. And one ways of this of doing these things right is to music, yeah, to learn about music, how to play and understand the musical harmony, because music calms the spirit. Music's make people feel certain ways that they can reduce the tension and the conflict that's going on in society. And goodness is the result of conscious activity. In other words, education is conscious effort to make things right. And that's is very important in Sun Tzu philosophy, because humans are bad. So you need to have a conscious effort to make things right. And then it's through education, through discipline, through music, right? All right, so that's the three brief overviews of Mencius Confucius, Mencius, and Sun Tzu, they have a different emphasis on the teachings. Basically, they emphasize on morality, ethics, right? And then you have certain aspects of the teachings. They are quite specific to each of them. So let's move on now. Let's talk about the classics. Classic of changes, classic of history, classic of poetry, the annals of the spring and autumn, and the classics of rites. Changes, history, poetry, spring and autumn, and the classic of rites. Let's talk one by one, just very briefly. So the classic of changes, that dating back to the early Zhou dynasty era that we already mentioned earlier, regarded as canonical since the Han dynasty, but dating back to early Zhou era. So this classic of changes basically reveals a supernatural influence. In other words, things that happen in this world have some connection to things that are in heaven or supernatural, not necessarily, in contradiction. So that's why the classic of changes emphasizes divination and fortune telling, or people use it as a manual for divination and fortune telling. It's about the dynamic balance of opposites. So the right and wrong, the light and darkness, female and male forces. So that's the opposite that need to be in balance. But this balance is a dynamic balance, and change is inevitable. So in order to live in society correctly, you have to understand its changes and use certain ways in order to be in line with this change. And all things change, and in a process, so you have the opposite of the balance of opposite, and then a process, and then change. That's why divination is very complicated, how to use the classic of changes for divination. When you can start your business, when you can open, for example, certain branches of your company. For many, they use the classic of changes to predict what is the best time, and to do certain things, to do the weddings and so on. So you use certain things, certain ways in order to be in harmony with all kind of opposite and forces, opposing forces in the natural and the supernatural world. That's just a the classic of changes. The classic of history contains some decrees, like royal decrees and speeches of the rulers about many things, about diplomacy, about how to govern society, how to relate to the other kingdoms, and so on and so forth. And in this particular classic of history, you also have some some narratives of the kings, sage kings, Yao, Shun, and Yu. Scholars try to interpret the Yao, Shun, and Yu, the mythical sage kings, as symbolizing civil and filial virtues. So they represent different ethical teachings. Again, filial piety is very important, and civil obedience or civic obedience. So you obey the kings, the rulers, also another way to put it. And then there's some criticism there against rule by force or military. So how to govern society, this is for the rulers. How to govern society, you cannot use force. You have to use discipline and education, and then showing the virtues, the morality. So that's one aspect of the classic of history. And then you have a classical poetry, a collection of songs and poems from 10th to 7th century BCE. People would use this as a model of a traditional literary expressions. And it's emphasized emotion and love and harmony, and so on. Classic of poetry. The annals of the spring and autumns. This is about good governance, or what is right about governments. It records political events, It also says something about diplomatic relations and relationship with others, and ruling families. And another aspect that I can see here, and we can learn from this Annals of the Spring and Autumn is that natural disasters reflect the influence of heaven on the world of humans. So again, the connection between natural disasters, what happens in this world, and how you relate to heaven, the way of heaven. So the way of heaven, and then the world. And this connection is emphasized in the Annals of the Spring and Autumn. It is quite historical and mythical at the same time. You have different commentaries in this book, in this annal. But some people or different peoples would use this classic differently. And then the other one, last but not the least, the Classic of Rites. This focuses on ritual, on rites, how to regulate, govern people, and what is right, what is li. So it's ritual procedures, what to do with regard to ritual, particularly. The sixth classic, the Classic of Music, was considered lost. So even though there are 6 classics, but you basically have only 5 classics that we already talked about. Another part of the Chinese books, especially Confucian books, is what is called the 4 books. This is when you have the Analects, where you have the Analects, the Lun Yu. So this is most recent later than the classics, but basically they are very much related to the classics. So the 4 books, the Analects, the Book of Mencius, the Great Learning, the Doctrine of the Mean, they are related to the classics in some ways, but edited by later scholar, Chinese scholar around 12th century Common Era, based on his interpretation and understandings, or the author's understandings of the classics. Analects, the Book of Mencius, the Great Learning, and Doctrine of the Mean. Let's talk one by one to give you a sense of what it is. So Analects, I already gave you some of the passages, in the Analects. Usually, it is attributed to Confucius, right? That he's the one who says that in conversation with his disciple. And again, the notion of exemplary person, Sun Tzu, morality, moral person, human kind person, you will find in the Analects. I already mentioned about Analects before, certain verses from Analects about education, about Confucius being a transmitter, not the founder of the religion or philosophy. You will find in the Analects. It is quite short, comparatively speaking. So the book of Mencius, again, we already talk about Mencius, and then you find those teachings in the book of Mencius, especially about good governance, filial piety. And again, one aspect that I need to add is husband and wife relationship is considered the most important relationship in this book of Mencius. Then you have the Book of Great Learning, also attributed to Confucius and his disciple. It's about self-cultivation and good governance. And it's a reworking of a chapter from the Classic of Rites that I already talked about earlier. So self-cultivation and good governance, maybe that's the key here. Self-cultivation and good governance. So self-cultivation means that you have to teach discipline yourself before you can have a good relationship with either with your people, your subjects, or with your family, friends, and so on. Self-cultivation and good governance. Maybe I need to emphasize here. Generally speaking, when we talk about Confucianism emphasizes good governance. In other words, politics is very important. It's part of being good, part of being human. part of being socially harmonious is to have a good governance. And this is quite different from, let's say, Taoism, that we don't really include in our course this time. But that's is how Confucianism and Taoism are sometimes contrasted. So good governance, the importance of good governance of politics, while Taoism tend to be pietist, you know, what is the notion of non-political, right? The doctrine of the mean, yeah, this is about the way, moderation, the middle path, and sometimes also described as the Tao. So when we talk about Tao, Confucianism also has Tao, and Taoism emphasizes Tao, so the way, right? So for Taoism, the way, the middle Tao, the natural Tao, the natural way. For Confucianism, it's not about the natural way; it's about the ancient way, about how to be in line with the tradition, with the rites, yeah, the notion of belief. So again, the doctrine of the mean is about the moderation. It's about how to make a balance between different forces. And here human beings, if sincere, could participate in the creative power of heaven and earth. That's another aspect of this doctrine. Now, what are some of the functions of the classics and the four books that we already described? State examination. State examinations operated since 124 BCE. And then you had this as the like textbooks for students, for people who wanted to be civil civil servants. Then they have to have, they have to pass the exam, using this textbook. Until about 12th century, then you have until about early 20th century. So you have a missing, so you have times where the classics and the four books were not really considered crucial in the education of the people and the governance. But then you have also the evolution, the ending of the book as being the textbook, especially 1905, where you have communism. The source of the Confucian's life, the source of the Confucian way of life, again, the notion of harmony, right? And how people also base the ethical teachings. You can also use the classics and the books, the four books. Political teachings and doctrines also would make some reference to the classics and the four books, including Analects. So political use, right? And then moral usage, so they use this moral guide or more guidance. And you have also many branches, including Neo-Confucianism, and you also have New Confucianism later on, and also revival of Confucianism in the modern time. They all try to make some reference to the classics and the four books. They're different. They interpret the classics and the four books differently, but they try to make some connection and reference to the books. Another way to understand Confucianism is dividing this into three: heaven, earth, and humans. So Tian, Di, and Ren. Heaven generates things, earth nourishes them, and humans perfects them. So you have this very interesting cosmology that many Confucians would subscribe to: heaven, earth, and humans. How about the notion of God in Confucianism? There are different understandings and different practices and different interpretations. One is Shangdi, Lord on high. So Shangdi or Lord on high is the notion of God as a person, a personalized God. It was considered, well, Shangdi is considered as the ancestor, the divine ancestor of the ruling family. So Shangdi was imperial God, you know, God associated with the emperor, right? The ruling family. So Shangdi was not really important among the common people. But it is very important because through Shangdi that they had the notion of mandate of heaven. If they believe that they don't have any more mandate of heaven, which is Shangdi, then they would, you know, be subject to revolts, rebellions, and so on and so forth. So their political authority would be based on this idea of having some kind of mandate of heaven. Shangdi is the name for this Lord on high. But you have another conception of God, which is more universally accepted by, including among the common people, which is heaven or Tian. Well, the notion of God that you also find in Southeast Asia, Confucians in Southeast Asia, everywhere also around the world. Although the meanings are various, so you have different meanings associated with Tian. The power of the transcendental, the greatest in the world, the most spiritual, the Lord of all gods, the moral principle, even natural laws. So some would define heaven not necessarily as a personal or personified God or being, supernatural being, but it is natural world or natural law, you know, the cosmic moral order, rather than as a spirit. So you have a different interpretations about heaven or Tian here, which suggests that again and again, you don't have really one monolithic conception of divine or the divine in Chinese religion and philosophy. But at least we know two of them, Shangdi and then Tian. So again, mandate of heaven, I already talked about mandate of heaven, right? You might find some references in the books like Analects or Mencius. Confucius say, if I have done anything wrong, may heaven forsake me. May heaven forsake me. So again, heaven really important. Mencius say, those who are obedient to heaven are preserved. Those who are against heaven are annihilated. Mencius. So in the notion of heaven, or Tian, the God that I already talked about earlier. All right, so that's the notion of God or deity or personal being, but also cosmic power. Ritual and religious practices. How about the practices, especially among religious Confucianism, you know, the common people, not necessarily the philosophical Confucianism, I mean, because different, you might say different branches or different strands of Confucianism, the philosophical one, and then the religious one. So those who consider Confucianism as basically philosophy, and then you have also Confucians who see Confucianism also as a religious practice, especially with where you know, when it comes to the notion of God, spirits, and rituals, funeral, and things like that. So you have the spirits, spirits of nature, spirits of the celestial, you know, the beings, celestial beings on heaven, former lord associated with the Shang, but not royal clans members. Some, you know, there's a less, and then you have direct ancestors. So different spirits, natural spirits, celestial spirits, imperial spirits, and direct ancestors, the ancestor spirits, the spirits of your ancestors. Sacrifice to heaven at Mount. This is just an example of the ritual among them, among many of them that consider emperor as the son of heaven. So now you have an emperor as the son of heaven, and in order to thank this, you would do certain, festival. One of way is to do this festival at the Mount. Mount Tai. Music, dance, prayer, sacrifice, usually sacrifice of animal. And this sacrifice has some purposes, again, to reach harmony in society, harmony in the family, prosperity for the state, physical longevity, good fortune, material gain, material success, blessings and health, protection from disasters. So different, purposes when you do sacrifice in this ritual part of it. Then you have temples, the Confucius temple, the temple of the Confucians. They would do the sacrifice to the ancestor in this temple. They would do divination, the prediction of the future based on the idea of, that we already talked about, the classic of changes before. And you would do wedding also in the temple, a Confucian wedding in the temple. In Indonesia, for example, it is called kelenteng. That's just a name for a temple where you have Confucians would do the worship, veneration of the spirits, veneration of Confucius, and also they do the wedding and social activities. So the divination that I mentioned, like using the Book of Changes, right? I already mentioned about this, right? To predict the future so that they can do their plans, their health, their harvest, their military campaigns, and they also interpret dreams and so on and so forth, using different tools, stick, dice, or other method of selecting numbers is often used. So you have different practices with regard to divination. But the important point here is in Chinese tradition, you do have this divination as somewhat key to many people at the top level, the ruling family, but also the common people, divination. All right, so basically I have introduced you to Confucian, little bit history, key figures, key teachings, ethical teachings, right? And then the classics, and then the books. That's the overview of Confucianism. If you have any comments, maybe, if you know something about Confucianism or had some question, you might want to ask here, and I will read before we move to talk about Confucianism in Southeast Asia. Anything? All right. If not, then I'll let me check the time. Okay, we have about 20 minutes. All right. No question about the lecture so far? Okay, no problem. Okay, let's move on. So in Asia, Confucians, again, you see the number 6-8 millions. It's not many, right? Chinese population have a lot, hundreds of millions. Maybe because, again, religious identity, is not an important thing here. Mainly in China, of course, and then you have East Asia, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and then you have Vietnam, which is another place where you have Confucianism very strong with regard to the tradition and the philosophy and the governments and the society, education, the writing system, and so on. But of course, Southeast Asia. One of the factors of the success of the Asian Five Dragons, Hong Kong, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan, people suggest is because of the Confucian philosophy. So why there is, city-state, yes, you can call city-state Singapore in Southeast Asia, right? Partly because of this Confucian philosophy shaping the way of life. Japan, we know Japan is Shinto, but Japan also embraces Buddhism and Confucianism and others as well. And Hong Kong is predominantly Chinese, and you have this South Korea also, you have the influence of Confucians apart from other religious traditions and others. So some suggest that Confucianism plays an important role in helping these Asian countries highly successful. Okay. So in Southeast Asia, Chinese migration, it's been since quite some time, right? Some suggest from early first century Common Era, Chinese migration, but some suggest the migration of Chinese to Southeast Asia had been, had started since 7th century, and some say even more importantly during the colonial time, especially among the British, where you have the British in need for workers for the plantation, for the factories and so on. So you had the Chinese workers coming into Southeast Asia, and then they become increasingly important part of the society. And even in Indonesia, you have Chinese workers coming in during the Dutch colonial time, and that's why the Dutch try to divide peoples or their subjects into foreigners or Europeans, and then foreign Orientals, and then the native. So when the Dutch say foreign Orientals, they mean by that Chinese, and in some cases also Arabs. Foreign Orientals. This is the the racial categorization by the Dutch, right? Just an example. And so that's when they had an increasing number of Chinese migrants here in Southeast Asia. They work in the tin mines, in small towns, in urban centers. They created voluntary associations, trade guilds, and they had patron-client relationship. They also had local protective deities coming from China. They brought it to Southeast Asia, and mostly from Hokkien and Guangdong. They basically brought with them their deities and styles of worship, including Confucian ones. So because of this migration, many Chinese in Southeast Asia had become predominant in different, it became very important in different cities, right? In Penang, in Malacca, in Kuala Lumpur, in Singapore, that we could become Singapore, in Southeast Asia, in the ports, for example. So they become very creative, very syncretic in some ways. The interaction with the local cultures is very quick. They pick up local languages very easily. You had many Chinese descendants in Southeast Asia who spoke Chinese or speak Chinese, but mostly they speak local languages, either Malay or Javanese, Sundanese, and so on and so forth. So it's not difficult for them to be adaptive to the local cultures, while they still keep their own Confucian ways or Chinese ways of doing things. So you have now in Southeast Asia around 7 millions in Indonesia, 5.8 millions in Thailand, 5.2 millions in Malaysia, 2 million in Singapore, in the Philippines, Vietnam, Myanmar. It's about 20 million Chinese. Again, this is a very rough number again, but at least you have some basic idea about the size of the Chinese, and then of course the Confucian tradition in Southeast Asia, right? So you see here the red arrows. That's how they migrated from China to Philippines to Kalimantan in Malaysia, Borneo, and then you have different localities in mainland Southeast Asia, and then you also have here island Southeast Asia, Singapore, and then Indonesia, right? So this is the migration route. That's why you have a concentration, major concentration of Chinese. You see the colors, and that's how you can see how they spread. Yeah, in Southeast Asia, about 20 million around, but I'm sure that they're more than that. Okay, now Chinese religion itself. Again, we talk about the Chinese religion as comprising, consisting of Confucianism and Taoism and perhaps also Buddhism, providing with a source of cultural identity. So some of them might have converted to Protestant churches, or Catholic, or even Islam, particularly, but they still keep and then they don't give up the ancient ways, the Chinese way of doing things, especially with regard to family, with regard to social hierarchy, with regard to ancestors, veneration of ancestors. So assimilation really takes a very very important ways in Southeast Asia, assimilation. So the notion of the foreigner and the pribumi, the indigenous, oftentimes has become a political debate that some people in Indonesia, in Malaysia, consider the Chinese descent as less native, less indigenous compared to them, and this creates some racist, and even discrimination and violence against the Chinese descent when they already very much local and they are born in Southeast Asia, the second, third generations, but because of their look, because of their race, they are facing discriminations, even violence in certain times and places. So it is not a resolved issue yet, especially with regard to politics of identity among the peoples in different parts of Southeast Asia. So that's another dimension of this assimilation encounter conflicts, and of course harmony at the same time. So I think this should be the last slide for today, or maybe a few more, but we'll see. Chinese beliefs and practices in Southeast Asia, divination, we talk about this, right? The prediction of the future. Well, when we talk about divination, to make it a little bit anecdote, you will have fortune cookies, right? If you go to Panda Express, yeah, you will get the fortune, cookies. That is Confucian or Chinese, way of predicting you. You will have a happy life, or your business will be prosperous. You will find a friend and so on, right? Things like that. But anyway, just to give you more anecdotes. But that's a divination based on the classic of changes that we already talked about before. Spirit mediumship, of course, because it's about also how to you relate to spirit, to be in harmony with the ancestors, because they are still alive in the sense that they are still your family even though they died. So spirit mediumship, shamanism is important aspect of this, that they can communicate. So you have a Taoist priest, for example, would become the medium between the spirits and the humans. Local deities, so you talk about that. There are different names about these deities in Vietnam, in Malaysia, Indonesia, different names, local names associated with either male deities or female deities. So you have all kind of deities. Ancestor worship, again, is very important. And funeral and marriage rituals, right? You would invite priests with regard to this ritual, and festivals. Chinese New Year, for example, would involve some kind of Chinese tradition with with elements of different philosophy. So that's it's some of the elements, some of the aspects of Chinese beliefs and practices in Southeast Asia. Divination, spirit mediumship, ancestor worship, local deities, funeral and marriage, and festivals. You have Chinese New Year festivals in Malaysia, in Vietnam, in Singapore, in Indonesia, in the Philippines, you know, and so on. So you have all these kind of things blended together. This is for Indonesia. So I think I will leave Indonesia next week. Yeah. For now, I think it's more than enough to understand certain key things about Confucianism and then Chinese migration to Southeast Asia, the size of the Chinese in Southeast Asia, and how that's also impacted some politics and culture, including the main. Sorry, why is this sound? Let's see. Sorry, can you mute first? All right. Okay. Let's see. All right, now I stop my slides here. If you had any questions, and I will give some time also for you, some of you who wanted to talk about anything like an office hour. So because for after now, 7 to 8 p.m. is not a good time for me to have an office hour, especially during the fasting month. It's with the breaking the fasting, also for some of the students. So I will give time to have office hours either beyond this time or maybe after our lecture, after Zoom meeting. Maybe if you have time, I will stay. If some of you wanted to, have office hours with me. My apologies for that. I know a few of you have contacted me to have some office hours, and maybe we can have an appointment and set a time for us to talk about, the course. So. All right.